go find it.
Ooh.
Even when you're managing your slack and you're constantly reeling, you're not going to feel the strike. You're going to have to watch that bobber and see it go down.
There we go.
All right, ladies and gents, in today's trout fishing video, we're going to go over something that's long overdue. How to catch trout using a mini jig and a bobber. We go over the bobbers, what types of jigs or minnows to use, weights, line, rods, reels, everything you need to know. If you like what you see here, make sure you leave a like and a subscribe. It really helps me out, helps the channel. And wait to the very end. I do an outro, and I'm going to sum up everything that I went over in the video. So let's see how we do. All right, now first thing we want to figure out is where and why to fish a mini jig under a bobber. And the simplest answer is, like I say in a lot of my other how-to videos, is trout are predators, and they have something that's called a prey drive. And all that means is simply that trout are more apt to go after something that looks alive and will move, as opposed to something that's dead and just sitting there in the water. So when you add movement to a mini jig or a spoon or even your bait, their prey drive will kick in, and they're more apt to pay attention to it. And sometimes they'll even hit it without even being hungry. It's just because they have this desire, something's trying to get away from them, they go after it. So simple as that. Now, one of the advantages of fishing a mini jig under a bobber is, in some respects, it's easier. In some respects, a little harder. I'll get into that in a minute. But when you're just starting out fishing mini jigs are very light and they're hard to cast. So if you've seen some of my past how-to videos, especially how to throw mini jigs and present them to trout, you have to have very specialized gear, very light line, certain action rod, all these things, in order to make a decent cast and then be able to present such a small, light bait and give it a good presentation. When you add a weighted bobber or a rattle bobber, which I'll show you in a minute, to a mini jig presentation, it takes a lot of that out, as it's easier to cast. Or especially when the wind kicks up in the afternoon, it's much harder to throw a 32nd ounce mini jig. But if you put a weighted bobber on there, you can throw it out real far and get a lot of action out of it. Another advantage is you don't have to get specialized line, specialized rod just for throwing mini jigs or any of that. You can use just your basic ultralight setup and just about any line like you're using on a bait and weight rod, because you have that weighted bobber to help you cast it, and that's really half the battle right there. Now, some of the disadvantages to fishing a mini jig under a bobber is one, you typically can't feel the bite. You got to watch the bobber. And the second reason, and the hardest reason, the thing that I have the most difficulty with, and a lot of other guys that fish this technique and some tend not to like it, is you got to constantly manage your line. So when your line gets slack, you'll see the bobber go down, and you only have a few seconds to set that hook. If you aren't managing your line and you don't have your line tight, you're going to miss the strike. You're going to see that bobber pop right back up by the time you get ready to set the hook, and you're going to miss the fish. So in that aspect, that part makes it a lot more difficult. As long as you manage your line, it's a fairly easy technique to master. But if you're not, and you're having trouble with that, it can give you a lot of frustration, and you're going to get a lot of missed opportunities. All right, now let's talk about rods and reels to use this technique. Good news is you don't need any specialized gear. If you already have trout gear, ultralight rod, 6 to 8 foot long, and 1000 series reel, and some 2 to 6 pound test on there, you're good to go. You can use a rod you typically bait and weight with, and it'll get the job done with this technique. So like here's a rod I typically use for bait and weight. It's a 8 foot Daiwa Spinmatic. ultralight. I got a 1000 series Legalis on here, and I've got 5-pound Runkle fluorocarbon on here. Great for bait and weight, but if you want to throw a weighted bobber and a jig on it, outstanding setup, and you can get it done no problem with this setup, and it's a reasonable setup to purchase. Next one is obviously a lot more spendy. This is my Mini Jig setup, but I use this to throw a weighted bobber on and fish a jig under it too. But again, this is a Katana K1, Shimano Vanquish, JDM reel, very expensive setup, very nice setup. It's ultralight. It's outstanding custom rod and reel setup. But it's spendy, and this will also get the job done. But you can typically use any ultralight rod and reel, 1000 series reel, and something 6 to 8 foot long, and you're good to go.
All right, guys, here are some of the bobbers and baits that you're going to use for this technique. Like these one at the top, these are the rattle bobbers, and they have a little bit of buckshot or BBs inside, so they rattle a little bit, and it gives it a little bit more weight, but yet will still float. So when you jig it back, it'll make a little rattle and help attract the fish. And then you have these type where they just have a little lead ring at the bottom to give it a little bit of weight while still allowing it to float so you can see the indicator. But these do not rattle. Whether you have a rattle bobber or one of these type of bobbers, I haven't seen it make any difference as far as the rattle and not the rattle. They fish just the same. I've caught just as many fish using these as I have the rattle bobbers. So I'm sure in some instances maybe it makes a difference. I just haven't seen it. So don't get too caught up on that. Just get yourself a small weighted bobber and you'll be in business. Now these baits, these are all the different types of baits you can fish. And you could fish live bait. You could fish power bait under a bobber, rattle bobber, and work it back. You could fish worms, whatever. But typically we're going to work on jigs and minnows. So your minnows, 2-inch minnow, I usually typically in all these weights, I usually like to go with the lightest weight possible because, like I said, these bobbers are weighted so you can cast them further. So you can really scale down on the weight on these. So I never use a 16th when I'm doing this. It's always heaviest is usually a 32nd, or I really like to go down to a 1/64th if I can, to give that bait more time to slowly fall in the water or just kind of suspend and look more natural. At least in my eyes, that's what it's doing. But we got our 2-inch minnows, inch worms, Powerball worms. You can even put on a ball head. Your regular 2-inch mini jigs, and then down to these micros, which I'm really starting to like fishing with. These micro jigs and these micro minnows on a 64th head. Excellent baits to use. You can present them real slow, especially if the fish are being finicky, and these things just work awesome. Now, how I rig these is essentially I'll use what's called a Palomar knot, or I use fly fishing clips, and I'll put a picture of it on the screen. But when you attach this bobber, you just attach it at the top clip and then run the line to the bottom clip so it doesn't slide up and down, and typically give it a 3 to a 5 foot leader. You can even go 6 if your rod's long enough and you can successfully cast it, just so it has a good distance away from this bobber, and continue to adjust the depth until you start getting bit, so you kind of find where the fish are, almost like fishing a slip bobber. But typically 3 to 6 feet, you're in a good range, and usually you can find them there. Once in a while you'll have to adjust it, but not too often. Usually around 3 to 5 feet you'll find them, and you'll have some success, or at least start getting bit if the fish are in the mood to bite.
All right, I'm going to show you the 3 kind of main techniques I use when doing this. And these aren't hard and fast. You don't have to only do this. Get inventive. Try different things. It's really a forgiving technique. It's hard to mess it up, honestly. So these are just some baseline ways I do it. The first is casting out. And one thing is important to remember is keep your rod tip up, because remember, your line is going to that bobber and you want to take all the slack out that you can. So 1, you can give that bobber action, and 2, when the fish bites, you see the bobber go down, you don't have to reel for 20 minutes trying to get the slack in so you can set the hook, because you're going to miss the fish, right? So you cast out, keep your rod tip up, and just light bounces like you're fishing a mini jig regular, and real slow retrieve, really slow, and just keep bouncing it. Just light enough so you can see that bobber moving, but you're not yanking the bobber out of the water, so it's not too crazy. Maybe giving it a little bit of rattle if you have a rattle bobber, and just keep continuing that process until you see that bobber go down. Because most of the time, even when you're managing your slack and you're constantly reeling, you're not going to feel the strike. You're going to have to watch that bobber and see it go down, even when you're doing this technique. Second way is even easier. Sometimes they want it this way. It's just a slow retrieve. Keep your rod tip up at a 45 and just a real slow retrieve. Just slower than molasses. Just keep going. Maybe stop for a second. And just nice and slow. And what that's doing is just dragging your bait just up a little bit in the water column. And as soon as you stop, that bait will come down slowly and settle underneath the bobber. Then it'll start up again and come back up. So you just keep doing that until of course, you see the bobber go down or feel something. The last and final, and this is the way I do it typically, it's my favorite, is keep your rod up at the 45, do like 3 or 4 bounces, slow cranks, and then stop. And what that's doing is bouncing the jig up here, you stop, and that thing slowly falls and settles below the bobber. So you just do 3 or 4 bounces, slow cranks, give it a pause. 3 or 4 bounces, slow cranks, give it a pause. Constantly, and when you pause, sometimes you got to crank up a little bit of the slack. Just try not to move the bobber. So let that jig or that minnow slowly fall and settle underneath it. And lots of times you're going to see the bobber go down, and you can give it a good hook set if you got your line managed, of course. So now it's time for my favorite part of the video, and that's practical application. We're going to go out to the water and put all these techniques into practice and get on some fish. So you see exactly how it works and that it does work. So let's see how we do. All right, guys, in this clip, I'm on the shore here casting out using a bobber and a jig at about a 5-foot leader, as you can see. Reason why I'm doing this here is just out about 6 feet in front of us is a huge weed bed. And we were throwing mini jigs earlier, not getting much, but just getting them into the weeds. So switched up to the weighted bobber and the jig, figuring I could throw it out even further with the weighted bobber on and work it back slowly, because I figured those trout are going to be right in front of that weed line, so I could really pause it right in front of those weeds. So as you can see, I'm doing about 3 or 4 bounces up at a 45, and then I'm lowering the rod tip, but I'm reeling in, and what I'm doing is the bobber's sitting still. I'm just reeling the slack in, trying to manage that slack. And then right about there, you can see I get hit and the fish is on. Bobber and jig on that creel. I'm gonna have to put my glasses on. I could barely see the bobber go down. Well, that's a nice fish. Just trying to keep them all of that muck.
I love when the bobber goes down.
There you go, good looking fish. Now this is a real good shot here because it gives you a good point of view on working that bobber back. As you can see clearly, I'm just bouncing the rod tip 3 to 4 times. I'm keeping the tip low. I'm not keeping it up high because there's virtually no wind here, and as you can see, my line's pretty straight, so it's real easy to manage my line. If the bobber goes down, I should be able to get a good hook set on it. But you can see I'm just doing 3 or 4 bounces and then just letting it sit there. So I'm letting that jig just slowly fall back under that bobber. And then right about here, you see the bobber go down. There we go. And the bobber and that jig.
There you go, 164 ounce bluegill. Got a bobber down. On that Goldschlager.
Rob, and bobber down.
Yeah. These cutties are so damn slippery.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Actually. Yeah, red under his jaw?
Yeah.
Yep, that's the same one I caught earlier.
All right, there you have it. Hope you learned something. I always do doing these because I go over my own techniques and kind of take my own inventory. So it's good for me too. But it's a fun technique, but it can be frustrating if you don't manage that line. You're going to miss a lot of bites. But if you stay on it, and the fish are real aggressive, it can be an absolute blast. And sometimes I've been out, and sometimes that's the only way you're going to catch fish. Sometimes they won't take it just regular mini jigging. They want it under a bobber. So once in a while, you got one of those rattle bobbers, weighted bobbers. You can outfish everybody, and that can be fun too. So with that, if you want any of the Golden State fishing products I use and you saw in this video, there's a hyperlink in this video's description as well as a QR code right up here. If you type in code CSpanker, you get 10% off. Likewise with the RHA spoons, there's a hyperlink in this video's description as well as the QR code right here. If you type in code GETHOOKED, you get 10% off. And the WaterLand sunglasses I love and wear all the time. There's a hyperlink in this video's description as long as the QR code will take you right to the site. If you type in code CSpanker, you get 15% off. So make sure you check all those out. So with that, got Sierra trip coming up next week. I also made it out to Green Valley and Big Bear, so those videos are coming up, and I did get into some fish, but it is hot up there. Unfortunately, the fish are struggling because we're having just an epic heat wave. I don't think they're all going to die. I think they'll survive it, but I think the fishing is going to be pretty rough for the next month or so locally. If you want to get trout locally, it's going to be tough. So I'd say head up to the mountains, and hopefully we get a break in this heat, and those trout can relax a little bit when we get back on them. So until next time, guys, tight lines.